proved a lot. Hello listeners and welcome to the NKNews Podcast. I'm your host, Jacco Zwetsloot. Today it's the morning of Monday, the 17th of January, and I'm joined here in Seoul around the new NKNews Podcast table in the dedicated NKNews Podcast room, joined by three members of the NKNews team, James Fretwell, Jeongmin Kim, and NKNews and NK Pro founder and CEO Jacco Zwetsloot. We're here to discuss some of the latest news out of and around North Korea. But before we get started, I have to remind you, as always, please leave a review about this podcast wherever you can, and that's so that people can discover our podcast more easily and our listenership can grow. Secondly, do go to nknews.org and consider buying a subscription. It helps to fund the wonderful and excellent journalism that my colleagues here at NK News and NK Pro put out every single day. And if you get the annual subscription, it's less than $1 a day. Thirdly, follow all of us on Twitter. You'll find NK News at NKNews.org, so that's easy. Jacco Zwetsloot is ChadOCL. James Fretwell is James Fretwell, where the L's are number ones. And Jeongmin Kim is Jeongmin with two N's, so Jeongminn, Kim, and I am at Jacco Z, or Z-E-D if you like the American pronunciation. And if anyone can help me to contact someone in the Twitterverse to get an all-powerful verified blue Twitter checkmark, please contact me. For podcast suggestions, feedback, and questions and complaints, you can tweet us at one of those IDs I just mentioned, or email us at podcast@nknews.org. Anyway, welcome back on the show, James, Chad, and Jeongmin, and Chad's banana that he's surreptitiously eating.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
First topic today, on the 23rd of February 2018, almost exactly 4 years ago today, well, 3 years and 11 months ago, episode 1 of this podcast went live. It was an interview with Andrei Lankov. Sound quality was less than optimal.
It was terrible.
Some people said it sounded like we were recording inside a toilet. We had quite a bit of echo. We didn't have any sound barriers, so we have improved a lot in that respect. And this episode that we're recording today will be number 218. So we've been going for nearly 4 years, and no sign of slowing down just yet. There are still a lot of people I want to interview, a lot of stories that deserve to be told, a lot of topics to cover, and of course new events and developments bring forth interesting topics and people that I hadn't even mentioned or thought about before. So I want to thank Jacco Zwetsloot and everyone here at NK News for giving me the opportunity to host this amazing podcast for the last 4 years and 218 episodes. I must say that it is definitely one of the things in my professional life that I feel proudest of. So long may these podcasts continue.
It's breaking news today that James is going to be our new host from the next episode. So it's been a pleasure.
Surprise!
Gabby, please cut out the last 3 minutes.
Just kidding. No, thank you very much, Jacco, for your great hosting over the last 4 years.
All right, before I get emotional, let's get these three guests talking. First of all, big props to Jeongmin Kim for getting a lot of attention from Korea's domestic media last week because of a question that you asked the two major presidential candidates, Yoon Suk-yeol and Lee Jae-myung. I watched with great pleasure and amusement a video released by No Cut V that began with your voice and edited it all nicely together. What question did you ask the two men, and why was it such a big issue?
So the question itself, I should explain myself, was
Please.
very tame, actually. The background here is Yoon Suk-yeol, the Conservative People Power Party presidential candidate. He held a New Year's press conference where I went. And as a final question, I asked him, that was the day that North Korea fired the third hypersonic missile, but we didn't know which missile yet in the morning. So I asked, they fired a missile this morning and the threat is continuing. What's your plan on how to prevent this? And it seemed maybe he took this as a missile. And then he answered, a missile that flies over more than 5 times of speed, if they have nuclear weapons or a nuclear warhead on the missile, it will take less than a minute to get to Seoul metropolitan area and conduct a mass killing. And he said that it's practically impossible to intercept. And he said because of that, we should use something called kill chain in South Korea's 3-pillar system, with a preemptive strike. And that preemptive strike part got a lot of headlines because that part, even if it's in the military guideline internally, politicians usually don't say that out loud because it's considered very provocative from the North Korean side usually. But a lot of outlets actually cut this part out, but his conclusion at the end was that because these missiles are so threatening and dangerous, we should see this as a reality and continue global diplomacy, quote unquote, and in order to use sanctions to pressure North Korea to stop these WMD developments and he said that we should not see this as a type of reality that should go on, the weapons development. So that was his logic. And then right after this, the Democratic Party held an emergency press conference to condemn the conservative candidate for saying something so dangerous and risky on the Korean Peninsula. And the following day...
So your question, or the response to your question, led directly to the Democratic Party calling an emergency press conference.
Exactly.
Wow, okay. That's the journalist becoming part of the story, Chad.
Yeah, you're right. But in the morning, it seemed that the Yoon camp was quite happy about the question and the response. And they are still defending it, saying that it was a hypothetical question. It wasn't. It was a hypothetical answer, and that technically that it's true that it's difficult to intercept is Yoon Camp's logic. But the following day, the Progressive Democratic Party presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung held another press conference to announce 2 military-related hires and issue a statement officially condemning North Korean missile launch as well as Yoon Suk-yeol's remark.
Okay, something I'm not clear about is, did candidate Yoon specify in which circumstances or what would trigger a preemptive strike? Like, is it just if we see the missile getting ready or
right? So after that remark, I called the top foreign policy aide at Yoon camp and asked them to explain what the logic was here. So, so technically, what he was supposed to say, it seems, was that if you see a clear, distinctive sign that a nuclear attack against South Korea is imminent, if you detect those signs that there will be a launch, you have to strike the target before the missile gets launched. So that's the logic.
And as you say, that's not an unusual thing for a military person to say, and it may even
internally.
Internally, exactly. It may even be written in the rules of engagement. We don't know, because those rules of engagement, as we've learned through this podcast, themselves are secret, right? They're classified. But so for a politician to say, this is what we would do, that's unusual. Chad, in all the years that you've been covering North Korea, have you heard South Korean politicians say preemptive strike in other circumstances?
The Park Geun-hye administration created the kill chain mechanism, right, which the South Korean government renamed when President Moon became the leader.
So what's it called now?
I've forgotten the name.
Sorry to put you on the spot there.
But the original kill chain, it did have a leadership aspect to it, which was to kill the North Korean leadership as well.
What they call a decapitation strike.
Yeah, so that Park Geun-hye was pretty gung ho about that, and
but did she talk publicly about it?
I can't remember.
Okay.
I don't know. But I spoke to one person who was at one of our events the other day, and they made a good point, I thought, which is here's the Minju party fretting about not upsetting Kim Jong-Un when Kim Jong-Un doesn't give a damn about upsetting South Korea any day of the week. And isn't it, the person said to me, isn't it prudent for South Korea to be thinking about these things and for the next president to be concerned about his citizens' safety and be ready to take preemptive action if and when required? So, that source's conclusion was that the left are maybe thinking too much. But yeah, Jeongmin,
yes.
Right, so I should follow up with the expert reaction to that and also Lee Jae-myung's logic against it.
Sure.
The expert reaction to that right away was that, first of all the controversy on conventional weapon versus nuclear weapon. It's a very contested idea because it's very, very difficult. If you want to preemptively strike a country that has a nuclear arsenal, you have to be able to strike all of the nuclear arsenals at the same time so that they do not attack back afterwards. So is South Korea capable of it? It's controversial. Mm-hmm. Second of all, saying something like preemptive strike by a politician, it's actually also Lee Jae-myung's logic as well. It's risky because it could lead to a war based on misjudgment on who will strike first, because everybody wants to strike first. So those two were the major reactions from the experts. And then afterwards, Lee Jae-myung held a press conference officially urging Yoon Suk-yeol to retract the preemptive strike statement. And I was also there. And I asked a follow-up question to Lee Jae-myung saying, so my initial wording was this to Yoon Suk-yeol. And my follow-up question is, if you were the head of the country's military, if you were elected as a president, and under the same circumstances, under the same premise that the nuclear attack against South Korea is imminent and very distinctive, what would you do? And his reaction was, it is true that it's in concept of operations to hit the target if the attack is imminent and there will be a mass damage in South Korea. But he said that it is in the military guideline and something the military experts should say in an operation room, not politician, because it's inappropriate. And he said that, and also fundamentally, he has a different conclusion saying that a president should be able to stably manage the South Korea and North Korea relations so that no missile provocation is needed. And he also actually used the word provocation.
So just one thing, 2017, Kim Jong-un said that, North Korean state media said, South Korea, U.S. military bases in the Pacific Ocean and even the U.S. mainland, our military is keeping an eye. Should the U.S. lose rationality and make the slightest move to conduct preemptive strikes against us, our mighty nuclear weapons will obliterate the strongholds of invasion and provocation. And they said that they will hit the US first should Washington show any signs of preemptive strikes. So
they'll say, we'll beat your preemptive strike with our own preemptive strike.
Yeah, so it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, as far as I'm concerned.
Jeongmin, is there any indication that the Korean public is at all in a tizzy about how either of those two candidates responded to your question? I mean, is it actually a thing that people choose who to vote about?
It wouldn't change their mind that much on who to vote for, but the idea of preemptive strike is, for South Korean citizens, something of that reminds them of the possibility of war that the Korean Peninsula is still going through. And it's something that the progressive voters and the conservative voters will criticize the either side, because the South Korean public were progressive were saying that Yoon is being too dangerous and risky, but the conservative I was monitoring the replies on the reports as well, and the conservative responses were that Yoon's idea is something that leaders should bear in mind.
Did you also get a chance to ask this question of An Chol-soo, who could actually be the dark horse candidate that wins this race in 7 weeks' time if one or the other candidates continues to be beset by scandals?
Not yet, but I would be definitely interested in asking him. I understand that there will be a press conference for foreign correspondents soon.
Oh, with candidate An?
Yes, but I'm not sure it was supposed to be on record, so I'll check.
Okay.
Gabby.
Right. Okay, James, new and improved missile tests, 3 this year so far. It's only, barely 2 weeks into 2022. What is a hypersonic missile? What does it all mean? Why is it significant?
Well, so first of all, a hypersonic missile is anything that travels faster than Mach 5, which is 5 times the speed of sound. So the important thing to highlight is that technically a lot of what we would normally just call ballistic missiles would also qualify as hypersonic missiles. So there's a bit of confusion over the terminology. What North Korea is claiming or what we generally mean by hypersonic missiles would be something like a hypersonic glide vehicle.
Okay, wait. Before we get into glide vehicles, so before this year, have there been missile types that North Korea has successfully tested that have gone faster than Mach 5?
Yes.
Okay, and do you happen to know what the names of those particular models of missiles are?
I mean, a lot of the, just generally when we would say there's a ballistic missile launched, that would be a hypersonic missile, technically.
Okay, so many of North Korea's current stable of missiles...
Would it be a missile that flies at hypersonic speeds, right, technically? The key difference that you were about to elaborate is the... hypersonic glide vehicle aspect.
Marv.
And according, yeah.
Is that a nickname?
Well, so in September, North Korea tested what looked like it had a glide vehicle, judging by the design, but South Korea poo-pooed that, weren't quite... North Korea claimed that it successfully tested hypersonic missile. South Korea said, well, maybe they're not quite there yet with that kind of capability.
In a back briefing, not on briefing.
Right. But the missiles that North Korea had tested this year that they've been calling hypersonic, it was a different design to what they tested in September last year. And it looks more like something typically associated with what you would call a maneuverable re-entry vehicle or a MARV.
Marv.
Okay. So a hypersonic missile with this glide capability, is it something that you basically shoot straight up into the out of the atmosphere and then it comes back in and then glides like a glider? Is that sort of the idea, generally speaking?
So these missiles would be deadlier because they would fly at lower altitudes and glide towards their targets. So it would mean that missile defense systems wouldn't be able to spot them until the last moment.
Is that because missile defense systems are often dependent on seeing the trail of an engine, for example, and then homing in on that engine?
Well, it's also to do with the Earth's curvature. So if you're firing a ballistic, it's a lot about trajectories. So if you're firing it just basically up and then it's going to come down, you can detect it from further away because it's flying at a higher altitude. Where if it's flying at a lower altitude because of the Earth's curvature, you can't detect it until it's closer to the target.
But crucially, it can also, as you inferred, it can maneuver. So if you look at the trajectory of the most recent hypersonic missile that was tested, the trajectory was on a display adjacent to Kim Jong-Un, and you can see it shot across the peninsula and then turned northwards after Russia and sort of swung up by the coastline of Russia. And you don't see that with a ballistic missile launch. Ballistic is just, if you lob a tennis ball high up, that's kind of a ballistic trajectory, and it will just drop down where gravity pulls it, right? But imagine the tennis ball can start maneuvering and going around the court and hitting the umpire in the head, something like that. That would be more similar to a hypersonic tennis ball.
And I think the key things here are that the international community would generally come together to add more UN sanctions, or at least enforce existing ones more tightly when North Korea launches either an ICBM, conducts a nuclear test, or a satellite launch, because those are the technologies that, are associated with nuclear weapons, of course, in the case of the nuclear test, but also long-range missiles that could potentially hit the continental United States. So why are we panicking about these shorter range missiles? Well, as Chad said, they can maneuver, and that causes more difficulties for existing missile defenses. That's why over the past year or so, we've seen lots of tests of submarine launched ballistic missiles, what North Korea is calling hypersonic missiles, missiles launching out of trains. They're all designed to combat existing missile defenses in their own different ways. It's like a cat and mouse game. The US and South Korea will always have to be, responding to these new ways that North Korea is developing missiles.
But it's also some of these new technologies, submarines, and especially rail, that's about survivability. So in the event that, going back to the hypothetical we talked about at the start, if Yoon Suk-yeol wants to preemptively strike missile launching capabilities or in North Korea, then it's going to be a lot harder to do that when you've got rail and submarine-based resources, which are going to be much, much harder for South Korean and US intelligence to track. So, yeah, they're really creating a real fortress. I mean, of nuclear and missile capabilities that is. It is.
Sorry, Gabby, we're just having some sound issues here.
Okay.
By the way, before you go on, Chad, I want to just welcome any corrective emails from technical experts on these issues. We often get them. Do send them to podcast@NKNews.
Guys.
Missile.
No. Wow.
Well.
Breaking news. We've just had a fourth missile for 2022 lobbed by North Korea. Jongmin, you bring up the details while we're talking here. Chad, go on with what you were about to say.
So, yeah, a lot of this is to do with survivability as well as what James just said. So the reason they're investing so much in submarine launch and rail launch ballistic missile capabilities is that so if someone like candidate Yoon becomes president and wants to preemptively strike North Korea, well, it's going to be a damn lot harder given North Korea is expanding its remotely configurable and movable capabilities that in some cases like rail could be deployed within tunnels and moved around the rail network. It's a lot harder to stop that.
So, Jongmin, yes.
While we were recording in here, it seems that North Korea fired another unidentified projectile towards East Sea. That's all the detail we have now, but that's back to back.
That is it. Is it, James, correct me if I'm wrong here, but these hypersonic missiles, have they just begun from this year? Is it, we've had 4 launches, but were there any hypersonic missiles with the gliding and the MAV and all that tested last year?
North Korea has started claiming to be testing North Korea hypersonic missiles from last year. Yes.
Oh, I see.
September.
Oh,
yeah. From September. All right.
Well, one thing with this this increasing frequency of missile testing, which, let's be clear, we haven't seen this tempo since 2017, the days of Fire and Fury. I mean, we are edging closer and closer to the Olympics.
Yeah.
And you're having the US last week calling for UN sanctions on North Korea. And I really wonder what Pyongyang's goal is, because as we get closer to the Olympics, the more and more that this risks really upsetting China. And just yesterday, as we record, China accepted the first train from North Korea. It doesn't have to do that. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to facilitate trade to North Korean ports. And I just wonder if there's anything on the North Korean side that is trying to somehow encourage China to get upset about this for some bigger strategic region. I don't know. I'm just spitballing here.
And we know that North Korea isn't going to the Olympics, so it's not like they care about the Olympics either way. But they could be trying to upset China. Yes, Jongmin.
But in Rodong Shinmun, they are writing articles that are praising China's efforts to make the Olympic safe.
Okay.
So they are not dismissing how Olympic is important, but they're just not going. But still, I feel like Beijing would be very upset about all of these North Korean missiles, many of them which were fired from the near the border.
Yeah, and it's literally 2 weeks, right? So if we've just seen 2 more missile tests now, and presumably the US is going to, you get this tit for tat loop mechanism that starts. We saw it extensively in 2016, 2017. 2 weeks is a short time for that to potentially get under control as far as Beijing would like to see things. So I'm just puzzled by the timing of this. It's interesting.
I suppose it's how close to the Olympics is too close. Because as you were both saying, if China is providing most of North Korea's economic support, so we would assume that if North Korea continued launching missiles throughout the Olympics, then this would really upset China. So maybe it's trying to do all its missile testing as much as it can before it would really start to anger China. We'll have to see.
James, you said that these are short-range missiles. How far can they go? Presumably not to the US mainland, but what could they reach?
Well, the Korean Peninsula.
Sure. What about China? What about Japan?
I believe so, yes. Yeah.
Guam?
No.
Okay. So therefore also not Hawaii. So it's a danger to South Korea and Japan at this stage.
Right, yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, that brings us to sanctions. America's latest sanctions against North Korea. Last Wednesday, Washington, D.C. time, the Biden administration revealed its second package of unilateral sanctions designations targeting North Korea just a day after Kim Jong-Un oversaw the test firing of the second hypersonic missile in less than a week. Chad, tell us about these new sanctions. Who or what was designated and what are they expected to achieve?
Yeah, so I believe it was 6 people and 1 company. Most of them were North Koreans, but there was 1 or 2 Russians and a Russian company involved. And they were all they're all overseas from North Korea, within China and Russia. And they were accused of playing a key role in facilitating the acquisition of components and know-how for North Korea's WMD and missile programs. They were designated under US unilateral sanctions. And
what does that actually mean? It just means they can't fly into America or they can't buy something in America?
Well, this is where there's a bit of redundance. So the US and the UN have already sanctioned for many, many years the behavior and work that these individuals were doing. So if any financial institutions were aware or suspicious that they might be engaged in this kind of behavior, then they were already frozen out of the US financial system. And they should, by dint of just having a North Korean passport, those North Koreans were already frozen out of the United Nations, the US system.
Yeah.
So there is a bit of redundancy there, but experts I spoke to said that the value from the US perspective of designating them by name was a reminder to like-minded nations that North Korean overseas representatives often do play a key role in sanctions breaching directly related to WMD. I think that there was a key part there. Secondly, it was symbolic. It came a day after missile testing. So it's obviously important from that regard. But it probably won't make much difference in the grand scale of things. And what one other expert said, who I spoke to, George Lopez, his name is, a professor at Notre Dame University, who was the first ever US member of the panel of experts way back in the day. A bit of a sanctions guru. He made the point that the Biden administration would have loved to get this through the UN, and they did try a day later. But he said after you had the likes of Trump and indeed Biden himself standing idly by as North Korea tested SLBMs and other medium and short range missiles. Good luck getting a UN sanctions resolution through. It's going to be impossible.
So America actually has brought this to the United Nations Security Council and hope to get some sort of resolution for new sanctions. Is that right?
Yeah. Washington's envoy to the UN, she posted, or maybe her office posted on Twitter that there was a new effort to get new designations through But there's been no new designations for years now at the UN, and we
Is
know
that because China and Russia have stymied them, or?
Not always just China and Russia, but mostly. But those are two countries that are wanting the UN to dial down sanctions. And there doesn't seem to be any chance of that happening. But I'm very, very confident they will be opposed to new sanctions unless North Korea does something like an ICBM launch or at the same time as the opening ceremony of the Olympics or something like that.
That would certainly be quite provocative for all concerned. Does North Korea's leadership or economy show any particular sensitivity to sanctions, particularly new ones?
Well, no. Let's face it, what North Korea's done with its COVID isolation is probably way wilder than any sanctions advocate would ever hope his or her sanctions could ever create in terms of economic pressure. But yeah, some people that I spoke to said that the fresh designations, even if just by the US, it just helps remind people at banks, financial institutions to be cautious when transacting or facilitating transactions of people, entities that may be close to North Korea. Hence the importance of the fact that this Russian firm and Russian national were named. Now, I should point out that the Russian Foreign Ministry put out a statement a couple of days ago condemning the US for this, saying it's basically fiction that Russians are involved in any way in facilitating North Korea's WMD missile programs.
I think Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has a whole stack of pre-written condemnations of US actions that can be pulled out at a moment's notice.
Quite possibly.
Jong-Un, tell us about the UN food program. What's it recently said about North Korea's food situation in a recent report?
Their gist was that because of the border closure and the international staff leaving, it was very difficult for them to deliver any aid for the vulnerable North Korean population, such as women, children, and patients, tuberculosis patients. And the last time they delivered food for these people was March 2021. That was when the country director for the World Food Program left, and that person was the last United Nations staff who remained in North Korea until the very end, before there was no humanitarian workers at all in North Korea. And even at the time in March, the food they delivered was something that was already in the stock in the country, and they ran out of it afterwards.
All right, so James, there's a new book of letters to and from former President Park Geun-hye. What attracted your attention in this book? I was in Kyobo yesterday. I saw it there on the counter by the cash register, so I realized that it was there, but I didn't know there was anything interesting about it related to North Korea. So fill us in.
Well, I'm surprised you saw it by Kyobo, because when I went there, they'd sold out in the Gwanghwamun Kyobo.
When was that?
That was 1 or 2 weeks ago, I think. So it is very popular. They had to restock it. I suppose what interested me is, we often talk about the North Korea's missiles and nuclear weapons, and if you live in South Korea, actually, South Korean people don't seem all that concerned all the time about these things. So I think it's important to remind people how North Korea can play into South Korean politics in other ways. So Park Geun-hye, as you remember, was impeached, was recently pardoned by President Moon Jae-in. Spent some
ostensibly
time
on health grounds, wasn't it?
Well, she was. She's still in hospital, I believe. She does appear to be in poor health. And the book is a collection of letters from her supporters sent during her time in prison. There are 166 letters, I believe. Most of them don't have anything to do with North Korea, but a substantial number do have something to do with North Korea, and a substantial number are supposedly written by defectors, which is interesting because defectors make up a tiny proportion of the population. So according to Park Geun-hye's team, the former president received tons and tons of letters during her time in prison. So her team handpicked which letters she was going to publish and respond to in her book. So the fact that she picked so many, that her and her team picked so many that mention North Korea and that were sent from defectors, I think shows that she wants to, that there is something about North Korea that she can use to kind of promote herself. And I think that's because if defectors are talking about how you are a bastion of freedom, well, who else would know the value of freedom more than North Korean defectors, right? Who have escaped the most oppressive country on the planet. And the other references to North Korea are generally about how the Park's enemies are, maybe have pro-North Korea sympathies, etc.
Does the word Jongbuk get used in the book at all?
It does, yes.
Okay, which is the sort of catch-all insult to all South Korean progressives and leftists who are supposedly in the thrall of North Korea and obeying commands from Kim Jong-Un, right?
That's right.
Now, it should be borne in mind that Park Geun-hye, before she became president, and I think even before she was on the road to becoming president, back in the mid-2000s, she visited Pyongyang and had a personal meeting with Kim Jong-il, and there's photographs of that. Does that get mentioned in the book at all, or is that forgotten now?
I didn't see any mention of that. I think it's important to mention the book. The way it's written, the format is that they'll print one letter from her supporters and then a reply from Park. So it's not like a biography,
right?
Or it doesn't really directly hint at what policies she would. I mean, she's not going to become president again, right?
No,
as much as some of her supporters in Gwanghwamun would like that to happen. So this book is really about trying to rebuild her reputation
and legacy. Yeah, I remember thinking about at the time when she went and had that visit with Kim Jong-il, that it was an extraordinary moment in sort of inter-Korean relations. That here we had the second generation, the children of two of Korea's dictators, not putting them on the same level and saying one's as bad as the other, but there were two people of legacy politics meeting each other, and there seemed to be at least a moment of hopefulness that they could find some common ground and something, but that obviously didn't happen, and at least in the long term. And when she became president, of course, Kim Jong-il had since died, but she did not have a better relationship with North Korea than her predecessors did. In fact, perhaps even worse.
Yeah.
Jeongmin, speaking of North Korean defectors, some of whom wrote these letters to Park Geun-hye, there's a story that 771 defectors have fled South Korea. Where's that number from?
Right, so it was a South Korea, so how it became news was that a South Korea media outlet based that number on a research paper written by a PhD student and a Korean National Police University professor in June last year. So it was old report, which alleged that 771 defectors had left South Korea and sought refuge in a third country as of 2019. But Unification Ministry dismissed the report as not factual and that the research paper misinterpreted statistics on how many defectors traveled outside the country as immigration number.
I guess it all depends on when you start counting. Is this 771 defectors from 1953 until 2019?
It seemed like a cumulative number, but it wasn't clear, honestly. And the unification, so yes, Unification Ministry, so how many did actually immigrate to a third country?
Yeah.
And their response was that only 20 defectors who were originally settled in South Korea moved to another country permanently from 2016 to 2020. So that's also a cumulative number, but that's counting from 2016.
And that's 20. That one of those would be an example. Would be our recent podcast guest Park Yeonmi Park, who's permanently immigrated to the United States. Should be one of those 20, presumably.
Right. So if you originally resettled in South Korea first, they would be counting that, but they wouldn't be counting defectors who moved from North Korea right away to other countries.
That is right.
So that number is not included. And the reason why this story became a thing in South Korea was because of the redefection recently.
Right.
And so after people found out that the person who crossed the border on
This is
January 1st,
a former gymnast?
reportedly.
Reportedly a former gymnast who had reportedly been working as a cleaner in South Korea near the border, went and redefected to North Korea in pretty much the same manner as he came down from North Korea, if it's the same guy, right? Just basically going through or over fences.
Right, through the land border.
Right.
And it got a lot of traction in South Korea. But unlike, at first people were talking about the possibility of this person being a spy, but later on, more attention was given to how it was so difficult for North Korean defectors to resettle in South Korean society, which is very, very competitive. And a lot of surveys came up about the difficulties of mental health issues and education access and so on and so forth, issues that people, defectors go through here. And the number in the research paper that Unification Ministry dismissed also stated that 30 defectors redefected to the north from South Korea between 2012 to 2020, and Unification Ministry said that actually that number is correct.
30 redefections.
Yes.
Between 2012 and 2020. Well, that's more than defectors moving overseas to a third country after settling in South Korea.
Different time period, but technically yes.
Right. Wow. Okay. Is that a hot topic for South Koreans, or is it something that's, it's in the news for a day and then it gets forgotten about quickly?
It was in headline for around a week, but then North Korea started firing a lot of missiles. So. Okay.
Well, yeah, that does tend to overshadow things, of course.
Embarrassing in military circles, though, in South Korea.
Oh,
right.
You mean the possibility of redefections?
Yeah, that someone,
security breach.
Right.
Someone can do this twice in a row. Yeah, pretty worrying, because this is ostensibly just a regular North Korean escapee and not a commando who's trained to cross the DMZ, knowing where mines may be and coming to collect information and so on and so forth.
And it's the most heavily defended border in the world, et cetera, et cetera. So how is it even possible? Jeongmin, you've got a comment.
Right. Also, importantly, the reason why the security breach was particularly of a more interest for people who are interested in unification policy, North Korea policy of Moon administration, was because it followed to the 2018 September Inter-Korean Military Agreement, after which South Korea and North Korea agreed to get rid of the guard posts at the border, not all of them, but part of them. And it seems that one of the areas that the security personnel got out from South Korean side to make it an unmanned one, this redefector used that area.
Right, but presumably there'd be CCTV and motion-detected cameras and things like that.
There's thermal. There's a device that can track thermal movements, and there are also CCTVs. But like we saw in past redefections and border crossings, it seems that the personnel at the border had difficulty real-time tracking what's going on because of the visibility and all that.
Yeah.
So was this in the middle of the night, this redefection?
Yeah, it was late at night.
Okay.
But, there's been calls that the South Korean army needs to introduce artificial intelligence monitoring and blah, blah, blah. The thing is, borders are very difficult to guard in any country of the world. And that, I've heard it from very, very senior USFK people, who basically say it's impossible to fully safeguard a border as large as we see between the two Koreas. So, yeah, this is probably something that will keep happening. And of course, you've also got to hope that the system is flexible enough to actually allow people who are defecting to get across safely and not be shot down or killed. And I think some people forget that when they see a breach, especially southward, that they forget that, well, you're hearing about it in the news because the system has worked. Right, and the person has been apprehended and is now, going through security and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, there may be times when it's not worked, but
these are the infiltrators and spies that we don't hear about.
Yeah, which if you go to the coastline of South Korea, I always worry. Actually, I'm going to Kaohsiung tomorrow for 3 or 4 days for a vacation. So
I didn't know that.
Oh, I'll be close to the action, and if you hear of anything,
excellent. Okay,
I'll be on duty, ready to report.
right.
Awesome.
We have also recently had Kim Jong-un's birthday on January the 8th. Was that a big media event in North Korea?
I was weekend watch that day, and the only thing that they focused on in state media was the follow-up to the party plenum. They were holding mass rallies across the country. There were a lot of banners praising Kim Jong-un, but there was no official celebration of Kim Jong-un's birthday.
Right, okay, so they haven't made that a thing yet. Is it actually a public day in the sense that it's on North Korean calendars? I mean, do North Koreans know, it's January the 8th, that's, no.
No, it's not official in North Korea, although the outside world knows because of thanks to Dennis Rodman.
Right, because he sang the song.
Right, and Kenji Fujimoto, the former chef, they said that the birthday is January 8th. But first of all, the year of birth is contested so far. Right. Some people say 92, 93, and 82, 83, 84. And it really depends. But from North Korean perspective, it will be so convenient if Kim Jong-un were born in 1982, because that way they will be able to match Kim Jong-un's and birth anniversary ending with 0 or 5 with Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il.
Right, so he would have been born on the 70th, or in the year of the 70th birthday of Kim Il-sung.
I want to know, because if I ever get the chance to meet him, I want to know, do I say Hyung or Tongzing?
Right.
Because right now you're supposed to be the same age.
Do you
right?
address him in Panmal or no Panmal?
Well, we're both leading our own entities. So.
Well, okay, that is. You heard it here first, folks. Okay, James, what else has been getting your attention lately?
I'm the news that perhaps there were the North Korea-China rail border is reopening ever so slightly, which of course would be huge news potentially for the economy, for perhaps humanitarian aid delivery. North Korea has obviously really tightly closed its borders since the beginning of the pandemic, and it seems this has had a really massive impact on its economy. So it's definitely something to watch.
Right, but what is it that, what's the old saying in England that a single sparrow, or is it a single swallow, does not a summer make? Have I got that right? That a single train heading across the bridge from Siniju into Dandong does not signify complete re-establishment of trade between North Korea and China. It may not be much at all. It may be just a single load of coal or something, and then something coming back in return from China. We really have to wait until we see how frequent are these trains, how many are these trains, how long are the trains, right?
Well, of course, and also important to remember, I mean, North Korea was never a huge international trade hub, even before the pandemic. But I think it's because we're so excited or watching this very carefully because this nothing has really been very little has been going into North Korea since the beginning of the pandemic. So we're all watching to look for clues to see, is it reopening? How much is it reopening? Even if it's a little bit of reopening, it could be signifying a trend that it's slowly going to go in that direction. So you're correct. It's not going to change the world, but it could be something.
And last year on the podcast and on NK News, we reported on the extensively newly built quarantine facilities in Siniju, right? So if a train does come back from China, it'll presumably go straight into those newly built quarantine facilities and sit there. And then the question is, how long does it sit there until it's deemed to be safe?
Yeah, which right now could be anywhere between 2 weeks at the very, very most optimistic to 2 months, I would say.
2 weeks to 2 months, that's quite a range there. Jeongmin?
I believe you're talking about the disinfection center that they turned an airfield in Uju into. We do not know what kind of rules they have at specifically that place, but as far as I hear from UNICEF, it seems recently their cargo, aid shipment, it was stuck in quarantine in Nampo and then were released recently. And they say that it took 2 to 3 months before they got into disinfection procedure.
Which is, before disinfection.
Right. So after quarantine for 2 or 3 months, they sent the shipment to get those stuff into disinfection procedure, and then they can get to the distribution centers.
So really, if you've got any perishable goods on those in that shipment, that's not going to be any good after the period of quarantine and disinfection anymore, right?
Yeah, imagine vaccine doses.
Yeah. Well, yeah, vaccine doses, food, and anything like that. It's not a good thing. Okay, well, that I think that wraps us up for today. We've got this fourth launch to go and report on. I can see Jeongmin is edging to get out of here and start writing. So thank you once again, James, Chad, and Jeongmin, for coming on the NK News Podcast, episode 218. And we'll be back again with a roundtable in our wonderful new studio very soon.
Thanks very much, Jacco.
Thank you, Jacco, for your amazing podcast
hosting
4 years.
For the past Congratulations. 4 years. Is it the 4-year anniversary right now?
No. I'm saying this now because the next few episodes have already been pre-recorded, but it'll actually be the 23rd of February will be the date that the first episode with Andrei Lankov went up on the website. Wow. So we're 3 years and 11 months.
Terrible audio, that one. Terrible audio.
Yeah, that's right. If you're new to the NK News Podcast, we don't recommend you go back and listen to episode 1 again. Stick with the newer ones. The sound's much better. Ladies and gentlemen, if you already have an NK News subscription, take a look at our NK Pro platform, which offers unparalleled services specifically catered to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access and a trial membership at membership@nknews.org today. And if you have feedback, questions, guest recommendations, or corrections for any of our technical details that we got wrong, send them to podcast@nknews.org or one of the Twitter accounts that I mentioned earlier. Our thanks as always to Arius Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating, it's always a hard word to say, this podcast, and to Gabby Magnuson, our post-recording producer genius. Thanks and listen again next time.